On the morning of June 20th, 2005, a 40-year-old man named Wang Diang stood just inside the doorway of a little home in rural northeastern China. Outside, it was pouring rain with all this crazy thunder and lightning, and also there were these hailstones coming down the size of golf balls, smashing into everything. I mean, just the impact on the roof must have been so loud. And so as Wang was standing in the doorway, he was actually looking out in the direction of the storm because all these people were running towards him to come in the house. Wang was actually hosting a wake for a friend, and he was hosting this wake at this man's home. And all the people running up to him were all the mourners coming to pay their respects. Now, by this point, most of the mourners had already made it inside the house, and so Wang was basically just waiting for the last few stragglers to make their way inside. And so from his post at the door, Wang is watching the storm and all these people, and he also took stock of the fact that as he looked out to the big tobacco fields that kind of were all over the place in this town, that was the primary way people made money in this town, he noticed that, there was nobody out there tending the crops. And even in rainstorms, people would tend these crops because this was their livelihood, but Wang understood why nobody was out there. Yes, it was the storm, but specifically, lately there had been these crazy lightning strikes in storms like this that struck the field. And so these workers that were normally out in the fields every single day, they weren't doing that anymore. Finally, the last couple arrived and Wang greeted them and brought them inside, and then he shut the door and then began making his rounds inside the home, making sure all the guests had what they needed, and also just kind of making sure the wake was, overall a positive experience, all things considered. Now, to be clear, Wang was not a monk or a priest or even a relative of the person who was deceased. Instead, he was just kind of like the guy that emceed virtually all events in this town. So if there was weddings, he was the guy who officiated the weddings, and if there were funerals or wakes or things of that nature, also Wang was often tapped to MC that as well. He was kind of like the village elder, if you will, even though he was only 40 years old. And Wang, he really treasured the fact that he was the guy that got to do these things, and so he put a lot of time and energy into making sure they went extremely well. So on this day, as he was making his rounds, checking in with all the mourners, nobody really needed anything. And so Wang sort of felt like he didn't have a role, and he scanned around the room looking for something else he could do that would be productive. And he noticed the incense near the casket was going out. And so Wang walked over, he pulled out the extinguished incense, he got a new stick of incense, put it in, and he lit it. And then he just kind of stood over the casket and closed his eyes and began saying a silent prayer for the dead. And as Wang did this, suddenly there was this deafening roar, and then everything went black. A few seconds later, that deafening roar faded, and it was replaced by the sound of all the mourners in the house basically screaming and trying to figure out what just happened. And so as people began kind of trying to size up the situation, they saw there was all this smoke near the casket and there was all these wooden debris everywhere. And then people looked up at the ceiling and they saw there was now a pretty good sized hole that had blackened char around the edges of the hole that was kind of smoldering. And then unfortunately, once the smoke really had kind of dissipated, Wang was laying right underneath this hole in the roof, and half of his head was gone. It was very clear he was deceased. And it didn't take long for mourners to figure out what had happened. Wang had unfortunately been struck by lightning. 2 days later, Wang's family held a funeral for Wang, and basically the entire village showed up for this funeral because remember, Wang was really a central member of this community, and so it was a really big loss that he was now dead. And candidly, this only stoked the fears that everybody had about lightning strikes. I mean, this was really becoming a huge issue. But after the funeral ended and Wang had been placed into a hearse and driven off to the crematorium to be cremated, the people at this funeral who were kind of making their way out began kind of talking a little bit more candidly about what had happened to Wang. I mean, it was obvious he was struck by lightning, but in this town, there was a lot of superstition around deaths like this, when it seems like how he died is almost like an act of God. I mean, how many people get struck by lightning? Even if you're scared of being struck by lightning, that is a very rare phenomenon, and everybody knew that. And so the mourners couldn't help but suspect that maybe Wang was not this incredible person that everybody loved. Maybe he had deep, dark secrets, and the way he was killed was like God's punishment, smiting him for the terrible things he was hiding. But nonetheless, the mourners who had just left the funeral followed tradition and actually walked over to the local crematorium where Wang would be cremated. Basically, it's the absolute final goodbye, and typically the family will stay there and wait for all the people to come by and pay their final respects, and then at that point the family hands off their loved one in their casket to the manager of the crematorium, and the cremation process begins. And so all that happens, all the mourners go to the crematorium, they pay their final respects, and then before long, Wang's family was brought inside the crematorium with the manager, and they were placed in this quiet room to kind of wait for this process to happen. And then the manager left them and went down the hall to the furnace room where Wang's casket was waiting for him. So the furnace room inside of this crematorium is basically like this big industrial space where in the middle is this huge, intimidating metal furnace, which is actually where, the bodies are slid in and burned until they're just ash. And so picture like the biggest oven you've ever seen with a big metal rectangular door and these rails that slide directly into this furnace, and the casket is placed on those rails and then kind of fed into the furnace. They seal the door and then of course ignite the furnace, and then the cremation begins. And so the manager, who had done this many, many times, walked up to Wang's casket, which was already placed on the rails. Workers had already set it up for this process before he came in. And so the manager walks up to the casket, he opens it up, he sees Wang's body, and he confirms that Wang is just wearing a robe with a belt, and he did not have any jewelry or metal on him or anything like that, which was not allowed during the cremation process. And so feeling confident that this was all good, he shut the casket and then slid the casket into the furnace. He shut the door, the big metal door, locked it, and then started the furnace. And as soon as he hit it, the manager heard the familiar sound of gas hissing as the gas kind of filled up the inside of the space, and then the familiar whooshing sound of the flames igniting. But as the manager kind of stepped away from the front of this furnace and was kind of making his way back towards the door, he noticed there was another sound coming from inside of this furnace. It was a hissing sound, but different than the gas sound. This was something else. And then before long, the hissing got louder and louder and louder. And then finally, there was this massive explosion inside of this furnace. And so smoke is pouring out of the sides. It was unbelievable that the furnace itself even held its shape. I mean, something massive had detonated inside of this thing. And in fact, even though that door that seals the furnace shut, even though it had not been blown off, the force of whatever detonated inside of there was so strong that the manager actually was knocked backwards from the blast. And so in a panic, he got up, and there's smoke filling the room, and there's flames kind of dancing out of the edges of this metal door in front of the furnace, and he hits the emergency stop, and the flames cut, but it's still all smoky and it's totally chaotic, and workers are rushing into the room to figure out what's going on, and the manager had no idea. This was something he had never, ever seen before. Just minutes later, firefighters arrived and basically extinguished the remaining flames that were kind of residually burning inside of the furnace and slightly outside of the furnace. Remember, this was a significant explosion, so there are cracks and breaks all over the furnace where some flames were still lit. But finally, the firefighters did extinguish all the flames, and then after it was safe to be in there, an investigation was launched as to what the heck happened in there. And so police officers went into this room and began sifting through all the debris in this room, both inside of the furnace itself and also, outside where it had cracked and things had shot off in different directions. And for a while, they found nothing. I mean, all they found were basically pieces of Wang, ash and some bone and some tissue from him. But there was nothing else that was unusual. But at some point, one of the officers did find something that was unusual. He found a piece of metal that was inside of the furnace that clearly should not have been there. Because remember, it's not allowed to have metal or jewelry or anything on the deceased when they're brought into the furnace. And considering what happened, they're like, okay, does this have something to do with the explosion? And so the officers kind of huddled around this metal and they began kind of cleaning it off to see if there was anything written on it. It's not a very big piece of metal. And eventually they had cleaned it off enough that they realized there was something written on it, and it absolutely explained what had happened here. So to understand what happened, you need to have an understanding of how the Chinese government responds to severe storms like the one that was going on the day that Wang was struck by lightning. So remember, Wang's village had all these tobacco fields all over the place, which was not only how the villagers made their living, but also China as a whole. They need these crops to be bountiful. And these huge storms that produce those golf ball-sized pieces of hail, those can severely damage tobacco crops. And the Chinese government doesn't want that to happen. And so the Chinese government has set up these things called weather bureaus, which are these government agencies all across the country whose job is to try to weaken these storms. And the way they do that is very interesting. They use a chemical called silver iode that they put into the actual storm clouds. And what silver iode does is it attracts ice particles and water. And so with this chemical up in the clouds, it kind of breaks up the hail a little bit and either makes them really small. And sometimes this chemical can actually completely destroy the hail and convert it from hail to just plain old rain, which is great. So how do these weather bureaus and this silver iode have anything to do with what happened to Wang? Well, unfortunately for Wang, the way these weather bureaus in China actually get this silver iode up into the clouds is they basically take a rocket launcher and fire a literal rocket, like an explosive device, that contains this silver iode inside of it, and the rockets get fired up into the sky, into the clouds where they detonate, and then the silver iode is kind of sprinkled all throughout the clouds. And unfortunately, on the day Wang was killed, one of those rockets were fired into the sky, and this rocket, it goes up, 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 it goes into the cloud, but it doesn't detonate. It turns around and falls straight down, and it just so happens to go straight through that roof into Wang's head, blowing off a portion of his head. And then the rocket itself got embedded in his torso and did not detonate. And then when he was wheeled off to the crematorium and slid into the furnace, and that manager turned on the furnace, that hissing sound he began hearing right before the explosion was the sound of that rocket inside of Wang's torso heating up and then finally detonating. When the police officers found that little piece of metal, what they had found was actually a piece of the rocket itself. And when they cleared it off, they saw there was a serial number for that particular Weather Bureau rocket. And so that was how they were able to solve this mystery. 3 years after Wang's death, the Chinese government came out and said, yep, this is our fault, we did this. And so they compensated Wang's family 80,000 yuan, which is equal to about 12,000 US dollars. And while that's a pretty underwhelming settlement to be paying for somebody's life, what is significant that came out of this case is following Wang's death, the Chinese government altered their rockets that they fired into these clouds, and they added this feature where if for some reason the rocket goes into the cloud and doesn't detonate, it will automatically deploy a parachute and will safely fall to the ground and not detonate. On January 30th, 1989, two young men were working the afternoon lunch shift at a Domino's pizza restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia. Their names were Daryl Wilson and Sean Burnset. And most weeks, this shift that they worked together was really boring because virtually nobody came into the restaurant. But on this day, at around 11 a.m., as Daryl and Sean are kind of twiddling their thumbs, waiting for the shift to end, a man who was obviously disgruntled and very agitated stormed in the door carrying a gun, a .357 Magnum gun, so a really powerful handgun, and he aimed it straight at them. Daryl and Sean were so shocked by this that at first they didn't do anything. But then it kind of dawned on them that, oh my goodness, this guy's coming in here to rob the place. And so Daryl and Sean suddenly put their hands up and they begin saying, okay, take whatever you want, take whatever you want. And the man suddenly began shouting something at them like he wanted something. And it took Daryl and Sean a second to kind of understand what he was asking for. But when they started to process the things he was saying, they kind of understood that this did not seem like a robbery. The guy was demanding that they call Tom S. Monahan so he, this guy, the guy with the gun, can talk to Tom. Now, Daryl and Sean may have known this, but probably not, because they likely didn't care. But Tom S. Monahan, at the time, was the owner of Domino's. Not like this particular restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia, but like the entire national chain. He was the actual owner of the company. And so this guy is coming in being like, let me talk to the owner of Domino's. And so at some point, Daryl and Sean understood who Tom S. Monahan was. Perhaps the guy with the gun explained it, or maybe one of them did know who Tom S. Monahan was. But either way, Daryl and Sean suddenly realized, oh my goodness, this guy wants to talk to the owner. But they have no way of getting in touch with the owner of Domino's. They're just pizza cooks. They're not like connected to the C-suite. But when Daryl and Sean told the guy like, hey, we don't know how to get in touch with the literal owner of this major franchise, well, the guy didn't like that. And he got really frantic and began yelling and screaming like, you gotta do it! You gotta get Tom on the phone! And so Daryl and Sean are like, okay, and they grab the phone and they try to call their own boss because they don't know who else to call. And as they're calling their own boss, this guy fires 2 shots into the ceiling. So this is like a really high intensity situation that's escalating really quickly. But Daryl, who actually was the one on the phone, he did his best to stay calm, and when his boss got on the other line, he tried his best to explain the situation as quickly as he could, because he could tell, this guy with the gun is very close to potentially shooting them. And the boss of Daryl and Sean did understand, okay, clearly there is a crisis happening at this branch. And when Daryl said, you gotta find a way to get Tom S. Monahan on the phone, like right now, well, his boss was like, I got it. And a few minutes later, Daryl's boss, who's still on the phone with him, was like, okay, I'm gonna patch you through. And then a second later, Tom S. Monahan hops on the phone and he's like, what's going on? And at this point, Daryl just handed the phone over to the guy with the gun and said, here you go, Tom's on the phone. And the man with the gun grabbed the phone, put it to his ear, and then began rattling off these totally bizarre demands. He wanted a white limousine to show up to the restaurant to be his getaway car. He wanted $10,000 in cash, and he wanted a copy of a science fiction novel about the Freemasons called The Widow's Son. And so Daryl and Sean, who are behind the counter witnessing this, they're hearing these demands, and it's clicking for them that clearly this guy is not mentally well. This is a guy who's totally unhinged, and who knows what's going to happen. After a few minutes on the phone, the gunman hung up and then told Daryl and Sean very calmly that now the three of them were just going to sit in this restaurant and wait for his demands to be met. And for the next 5.5 hours, that's what they did. Daryl, Sean, and the gunman, who just kept the gun aimed at Daryl and Sean, they just sat inside of this restaurant. And at the same time, by this point, the police have been called, and they're completely surrounding this restaurant. And when the gunman came into the store, because this was a very slow day, there weren't any other customers or staff inside, so it really was just Daryl, Sean, and the gunman. And so it's a total standoff. But interestingly, for Sean and Daryl, who were right there with this gunman, they started to sense that this guy was not here to hurt them. He was really after Tom S. Monahan, and over those 5.5 hours, they were just sitting there with him with his gun aimed right at them. He periodically began telling them, what his gripes were with Tom S. Monahan. The gunman told Daryl and Sean that Tom was specifically targeting him, the gunman, and also Tom was secretly communicating with the gunman when the gunman didn't want to talk to him, almost like telekinesis or something. And also the gunman told them that Tom S. Monahan periodically will walk around his property at night, kind of creeping around, scaring the gunman. And Daryl and Sean, they're hearing these things and not believing any of it, but they were very empathetic and said, oh yeah, I can understand why that would be an issue. I can understand why you'd come in here and demand to speak to Tom S. Monahan. Yep, totally get it. And that was just kind of how the day was going. And then around 4:30 p.m., so they've been in there a long time by this point, the gunman told Daryl and Sean that he was really hungry, so they better go make him some pizzas. So Daryl and Sean just got up, they went in the back, they made 2 large everything pizzas, and after they were made, they put them in boxes and slid them across the counter to the gunman. And at this moment, Daryl and Sean knew the gunman, in order to eat, would have to put his weapon down to open up the box and get the pizza. And so the second they handed it over, without even communicating with each other, they kind of waited for the gunman to put the gun down. And he did. He put the gun down. He opened the pizza up. He grabbed a slice. And at that moment, Daryl and Sean began sprinting past him towards the door. And the gunman, who's seeing this happen, he drops the pizza, he grabs the gun, and he turns, and he aims. So to really understand what's happening here, you need to understand what type of marketing Domino's, like the national franchise, was doing to advertise their product. Starting in 1985, Domino's came up with a very popular advertising campaign called The Noid. And the Noid was actually a character. It was like this weird claymation character with big sneakers and bunny ears. He was like this goofy thing that was the equivalent of McDonald's Hamburglar, but this was for pizza. And what Domino's did with the Noid is they would run these ads on TV where the Noid was like this menace who was always out to disrupt pizza deliveries. Not necessarily Domino's pizza deliveries, but generally pizza deliveries, it's like the Noid's gonna destroy them, either by, freezing the pizzas on their way to the person's house, or smashing them into the ground, or causing whatever mayhem the Noid could create to stop pizzas from getting to their customers. And so Domino's kind of catchy thing was avoid the Noid with Domino's, meaning like Domino's, the chain, was the only chain capable of avoiding all the chaos that could disrupt you getting the thing you want, your pizza. And this advertising campaign was brilliant, not only because it really worked, people really liked Domino's because it did seem like they were superior, but also they were able to kind of franchise this character itself, the Noid. It became a toy you could buy, and there was talk about doing a TV show and maybe a movie around this Noid character. And Michael Jackson, like the king of pop, he put the Noid in one of his music videos. I mean, this was a really, really successful advertising campaign, but for as successful as this campaign was, it did unfortunately lead to what happened inside of this Domino's restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia. So on the day, this gunman came charging in and held up the place, aiming the gun at Sean and Daryl. It would turn out the gunman's name was Kenneth Lamar Noyd. And Kenneth Lamar Noyd was not going into the store to get money or to steal food or to hurt, Daryl or Sean. He was there to get his revenge on Tom S. Monahan, who he looked at as the person responsible for coming up with this Noyd campaign. Because Kenneth Lamar Noyd was very mentally ill, and he believed the Avoid the Noyd campaign was not a marketing campaign, but rather Tom S. Monahan specifically targeting Kenneth Lamar Noyd, basically making him out to be this big villain. But Kenneth's plan for how to deal with this totally backfired, because in a totally ironic twist, by holding up this Domino's franchise and creating this huge standoff, he literally became like the Noyd because no pizza deliveries could be had that entire day out of that franchise. And so Kenneth Lamar Noyd, in an effort to stop Tom S. Monahan from running this Noyd campaign, because I'm no villain, I don't go after pizzas, I don't try to stop people from getting their pizzas. In an effort to do that, that is exactly what he did. He literally became the human version of the Noyd. And so after Daryl and Sean made a run for it towards the door, Kenneth did grab his gun and he did aim it at the two men, and he even fired it a couple of times, but he missed, and Daryl and Sean were totally unhurt. In fact, nobody got hurt. All that happened is Kenneth Lamar Noyd looked like the Noyd and he got arrested. However, instead of going to jail, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. As for the actual advertising campaign itself, which was very successful, Avoid the Noyd, well, it would not survive this total PR nightmare, and Tom S. Monahan canceled it immediately after Kenneth Lamar Noyd was taken off. So in a weird way, Kenneth actually did sort of get his revenge.
Avoid the Noyd. Domino's Pizza delivers. Call now.
On the evening of November 27th, 1998, 25-year-old Corey Parker pulled a pie out of the oven in the kitchen of her first-floor apartment in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. She put the pie down on the counter near the open kitchen window to help it cool. This pie was one of a few that Corey had made in preparation for Thanksgiving, which was the following day. Corey had always loved Thanksgiving, but she was really looking forward to the holiday this year. A few months earlier, she had moved from Rochester, New York to Jacksonville Beach. So this was the first time she'd lived on her own, and the first time she was going to celebrate what she called Friendsgiving. Corey and a bunch of others who weren't spending the holiday with family were all making different Thanksgiving foods and getting together at a friend's house on the holiday. Corey cleaned up the small mess she'd made while baking all day, she walked through the apartment to the bathroom, and she took a shower. After her shower, Corey did her makeup and her hair, and then went to her bedroom closet. She scanned the clothes that were hanging up, and she grabbed a pair of black pants and a blue velvet tank top. Then she picked up her favorite pair of black high heels, stepped into her room, and got dressed. She walked through the apartment, grabbed her keys off the coffee table, and headed outside. Corey locked the door behind her, and then walked down a sidewalk that led past several small apartment buildings just like hers. Each of the buildings looked like an old house that had a few apartments in it. Corey loved this spot in the small beach town where she lived, because this was the first place where she felt like she was truly independent. But she also loved it because the apartments close to hers were home to a lot of other young people. And tonight, Corey saw a bunch of them hanging out outside. She saw people drinking beer and smoking in front of their apartments. Her teenage neighbor from the building behind hers was listening to music on a second-floor balcony, and others were walking to their cars to go out for the night. Corey could also see people who had spent the day drinking at the nearby beach, laughing and stumbling down the street that ran in front of the apartment buildings. The noise and near-constant activity around the apartments drove some people crazy, but Corey liked it when there were a lot of people around. She thought it was fun, but it also made her feel safe to know that she was not out there by herself at night. Because recently, some of the women who lived nearby had caught a peeping Tom watching them through their windows. None of the women had gotten a really good look at him, but they thought he looked like a middle-aged man, and that there was a good chance he lived in one of the apartments. But tonight, there were plenty of people out, so Corey didn't worry about some strange man creeping around the apartments trying to spy on young women. Corey stepped off the sidewalk and crossed a small patch of grass to where her car was parked on the street. She got in, started the car, cranked up her stereo, and sped off down the street. She drove for a few blocks and pulled onto a road that ran alongside the beach and was lined with bars and restaurants. This was the town's main drag, and it was already packed with cars and people. Jacksonville Beach was a resort town that hosted a lot of tourists who came to spend time at the beach and to enjoy themselves at all these touristy bars and restaurants down by the water. Corey worked as a waitress at one of those kinds of restaurants, and she enjoyed it. It was exciting getting to meet and talk to people from all over the place, but when Corey and her friends went out, they preferred to go to places where the locals hung out. So Corey pulled off the main drag onto a side street, and a couple of minutes later, she saw the big lit-up sign for her favorite bar and lounge called The Ritz. Corey pulled into the Ritz parking lot, checked her makeup in the rearview mirror, and then got out of her car. As she walked across the parking lot, she could already hear the live music blaring inside. Corey showed her ID to the bouncer at the door, and then she stepped inside the club. And as soon as she did, it was almost like the whole place started moving in slow motion or something. Because when Corey walked inside, almost everybody turned to look at her. Corey was 5 foot 11 inches tall, and in her heels, she stood well over 6 feet tall. She was beautiful with long brown hair, and a lot of people who met her, especially when she was dressed up for a night out, just assumed she was a model or an actress. Corey didn't mind the attention, but recently she'd started dating a new guy, and it was getting pretty serious. So she wasn't at the club to meet anyone new. She was there to spend time with one of her best friends, and just to have a good time. Just then, Corey heard a loud scream over the music coming from somewhere behind her. She turned, and her face lit up. One of Corey's best friends, Tiffany Zienta, ran over, wrapped her arms around Corey's waist, and gave her a big hug. Then the two women made their way to the bar and ordered some drinks. And while they waited, they talked about their plans for Thanksgiving. And Corey said how excited she was for Friendsgiving. Tiffany said she was a bit jealous. She was spending the holiday with her parents, which was okay, but spending time with Corey and other people their age sounded way more fun. The bartender came over and handed Corey and Tiffany their drinks. The two women raised their glasses, downed the drinks, and cheered on the band playing. At 1:30 a.m. on November 28th, so a few hours after Corey had arrived at the Ritz, she got into her car and started driving home. She knew she had a big day ahead of her, so she had kept her drinking to a minimum. That's why she had passed when Tiffany had asked her to stay out a bit later and go bar hopping with them before heading home for the night. Tiffany was bummed, but Corey knew she did not want to be completely exhausted for Thanksgiving. Corey drove down the street in front of her building, parked her car, and stepped outside. She walked down the sidewalk to her apartment, and as she did, she felt herself tense up a bit. It was a lot quieter than it had been when she left, and nobody else seemed to be around. Corey approached her apartment, and she saw a few people out on their balconies in the buildings next to hers and behind hers, and this made her relax a bit. She unlocked her front door, went inside, and locked the door behind her. Then she dropped her keys on the coffee table and went to her bedroom. She slipped off her heels and tossed the shoes and her purse onto the floor, and then she got undressed, climbed into bed, and fell asleep pretty quickly. But just a little later, Corey woke up, startled. It was dark and she was disoriented, but she thought she heard someone breathing. At 11 a.m. on November 29th, so the day after Thanksgiving, a cook at a Jacksonville Beach restaurant prepped his station in the kitchen, getting ready for the lunchtime rush. The cook glanced at his watch and stopped what he was doing. He walked out of the kitchen and scanned the restaurant floor, and he got worried when he didn't see Corey. The cook and Corey not only worked together, but they were also friends, and so they would let each other know if they were going to miss a shift. So the cook quickly met with some of the waiters and other kitchen staff to see if any of them had seen or heard from Corey this morning, but none of them had. And one of the waitresses said she was really concerned because she had called Corey the day before when she had heard from a mutual friend that Corey had not shown up for Friendsgiving. The restaurant manager came over and he said he was worried too. He'd tried calling Corey a couple of times this morning and hadn't heard back, and it was not like her to just blow off a shift without calling in. The manager asked the cook if he knew where Corey lived. The cook said he did, so the manager asked him to go by Corey's place to check on her and make sure she was okay. The cook took off his apron and then walked out to his car and sped out of the parking lot. A few minutes later, he arrived at Corey's apartment. He went up to the front door and knocked, but nobody answered. He knocked again, but it didn't sound like anybody was inside the apartment. And so the cook walked around the apartment to the back, and he found Corey's bedroom window. He looked inside, and he could see part of Corey's room through a small opening in the blinds. He thought he saw Corey, or at least her legs, lying in her bed. He knocked on the glass and waited, but he didn't see any movement inside. So he pressed his face right up against the window to get a better look, and immediately he felt his heart start to race. He turned away from the window and ran as fast as he could back to his car and sped back to the restaurant. The cook ran inside, and the manager and the other staff members could tell something was obviously wrong, but the cook didn't even say a word. Instead, he ran to the front counter, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, 2 Jacksonville Beach police officers arrived at Corey's apartment. The call they had gotten from dispatch had been kind of vague, because the young man who had called 911 said he really hadn't seen much. Apparently, he'd looked through a small opening in the window blinds, and he thought he saw his friend laying in bed. And he thought he saw blood on her foot. So the officers didn't really know if they were dealing with a potential accident, a violent crime, or if the caller had just panicked and dialed 911 without really even seeing anything. And so the officers walked up to Corey's front door and they knocked, but nobody answered. One of them tried the doorknob, but it was locked. So they walked around the side of the apartment and they saw that the kitchen window was open. One of the officers told his partner to wait right there by the side of the house, and he said he would check out the apartment. Then he put on a pair of gloves, opened up the window a bit more, and then climbed through the opening into the kitchen. Once inside the apartment, the officer called out and introduced himself as a police officer in case anyone was home. But nobody responded. It was totally silent. And so he began looking around the kitchen, but there was nothing there that looked strange. There was no sign of a robbery or a struggle, and then also he checked the front room of the apartment, and there also was nothing there. And so he walked to the back of the apartment where Corey's bedroom was. The officer got to the bedroom door, and he saw it was slightly cracked open. Before opening it, he called out one more time, not wanting to frighten anybody if they were sleeping in the room, but there still wasn't any response. And so the officer opened the bedroom door, looked into the room, and was absolutely horrified by what he found. Minutes later, detectives Katie Kingston and Billy Carlisle arrived at Corey's apartment. They were followed by several uniformed police officers and a forensics team. Kingston and Carlisle ducked under the crime scene tape that had been strung up across Corey's front door. They walked inside and quickly found their way to the bedroom. The detectives stepped into the room, and immediately they felt just as shocked as the officer who had first arrived on scene. A young woman lay in bed, propped up against the headboard. She was completely naked, and her whole body was covered in blood. And there was so much blood spatter on the wall behind the bed that it looked like someone had thrown a bucket of red paint against the wall. As Detective Kingston walked closer to the bed, she could barely wrap her mind around what she was looking at. This poor young woman had sustained an unthinkable number of stab wounds. Then Kingston noticed something laying on the bed next to Corey. Now at first, it just looked like another bloodstain, but Kingston leaned down and saw that it was actually a pair of bloody women's underwear. Kingston heard her name, and she turned to see Carlisle crouched over, looking at something on the floor near the bed. She went over to him, and she saw he had found a gold cigarette lighter. The detectives walked the rest of the room, but other than the lighter and the underwear, nothing really jumped out at them. They saw some clothes and shoes on the floor, but they were not drenched in blood like the underwear. The detectives also found a purse in the bedroom with a driver's license inside, and so they were able to officially identify the victim as Corey Parker. Kingston and Carlisle stepped aside and let a couple of forensics officers get to work in the bedroom. The forensics officers were able to take multiple blood samples, but the investigators realized there was a chance that all this blood was the victims, not the killers. Then one of the forensics officers looked more closely at Corey's body, and he said the medical examiner would have to weigh in, but he didn't see any signs of sexual assault. And so Kingston and Carlisle theorized that, maybe Corey had just gone to bed naked, or maybe the killer had stripped off her underwear either during the attack or afterwards for some unknown reason. The forensics officer motioned for the 2 detectives to look, and when they leaned down, they saw a strand of hair on Corey's underwear, and it definitely did not match Corey's. And so the detectives believed that, given the location of this piece of hair on her underwear, and the insane level of violence inflicted on Corey, meant they were most likely looking for a current or former intimate partner. Throughout the afternoon, the investigative team searched the apartment and the surrounding area, and the detectives caught something that the first officers on the scene had missed. There were drops of blood on the kitchen counter and on the outside kitchen windowsill. The officers that arrived first had told Kingston and Carlisle that the kitchen window had been open when they got there. That's how they got inside. And so the detectives imagined that this is where the killer must have entered and exited the apartment. And so they hoped that the blood on the counter and the windowsill belonged to the killer. The forensics team took blood samples from both of those spots and prepped them to be sent to the lab along with the blood samples from the bedroom and the strand of hair they'd found on the underwear. In 1998, DNA testing was starting to evolve, but the process was still slow, and it was not always as effective as it is today. So Kingston and Carlisle knew they could be waiting a while for any test results, and that those results might not tell them anything. In the meantime, they wanted to speak to people who might have seen something that night or who knew Corey well. That afternoon, the detectives canvassed the apartment buildings nearby, and several people who had been on their balconies or in front of their apartments thought they had seen Corey leaving her apartment the night before Thanksgiving. And none of them had seen or heard anything strange in that area over the past 2 days. One neighbor also said she had met Corey's new boyfriend, and she provided enough information that an officer back at the station was able to quickly track him down. And it turned out the boyfriend was away visiting his family for Thanksgiving, and the officer was able to find proof that he had taken a flight days before Corey was killed, so detectives Carlisle and Kingston did not consider the boyfriend a prime suspect. But Corey could have been seeing someone else, or she could have had ex-lovers who were jealous about her new relationship. So, after getting confirmation about the boyfriend's alibi, Kingston and Carlisle got in their car and drove a few blocks away to the restaurant where Corey had worked, hoping one of her coworkers might have additional information about Corey's personal life. They walked in, and the whole place felt like something heavy was hanging over it. The staff were going about their jobs, but it was obvious they were all waiting for news on their friend, Corey. Kingston and Carlisle pulled the manager into the kitchen, and the manager quickly waved over the cook who had called 911. Then the detectives told them that Corey had unfortunately been found dead inside of her apartment. The cook immediately started crying, and the manager closed his eyes and tried to fight back tears. Kingston told them the police would need to talk to everybody at the restaurant who knew Corey, but for now, they wanted to know if there was somebody working there who might have had an intimate relationship with Corey, a boyfriend or even a casual fling. The manager and the cook looked at each other like they were thinking the same thing. The cook said Corey was not actively seeing anybody from the restaurant, but there was a dishwasher who worked there named Eric Ely who wished he had a relationship with Corey. Detective Carlisle asked if he meant that this guy Eric had a crush on Corey, but the cook just shook his head and told the detectives that Eric did not just have a crush on Corey. He was completely obsessed with her. The following day, detectives Kingston and Carlisle sat in an interview room waiting for the dishwasher, Eric Ely, to arrive. Eric had not been at the restaurant the previous day when the detectives were there, but they had spoken to several other staff members about him, and almost all of the women they spoke to at the restaurant said the same thing. Eric was a total creep, and he harassed Corey way more than he harassed anybody else. An officer led Eric into the interview room, and he took a seat across from the detectives. Eric was in his 20s, he had long light brown hair, and as he sat down, he smiled at the detectives. Eric already knew that Corey had been killed, and so Kingston didn't waste any time with pleasantries. She wanted to press Eric right from the start. She leaned across the table and asked Eric point blank if it was true that he was obsessed with Corey. Eric smiled a bit wider and said maybe he was a little obsessed, but Kingston immediately went after him. She said police knew he was more than just a little obsessed. They knew that he had asked Corey on multiple occasions to spend Thanksgiving alone with him, and that even after she turned him down every time, Eric had made a huge Thanksgiving feast and then planned to try to guilt her into coming to his apartment. The smile on Eric's face disappeared. He looked at Kingston and admitted that he was completely obsessed with Corey. But he said he just wanted to spend time with her. He would never hurt her. But then Eric said something that took the detectives by complete surprise. He asked them how Corey was killed. Without missing a beat, Carlisle asked Eric how he thought Corey might have been killed. And Eric immediately got this look on his face like he was having a daydream or something. And then he said he thought the killer probably attacked Corey while she was tired or sleeping and stabbed her. The detectives both looked stunned. Eric had just described, at least in a general way, how Corey had actually been murdered. So Kingston said it sounded like Eric knew a lot about the murder. And what Eric said next stunned the detectives even more. Eric smiled again and told them that maybe he knew how the killer did it because he had fantasized about doing the same things. Kingston asked in a calm voice what kind of fantasies Eric had, and Eric said sometimes he fantasized about raping and murdering women. But before the detectives could even react, Eric said those were just fantasies. He never acted on them, and he never hurt Corey. Kingston and Carlisle talked to Eric for a while longer, and then they ended the interview. They told him he could go, but they made it clear he should not leave town. An officer came in and escorted Eric out of the interview room, and for a second, Kingston and Carlisle just sat there without talking. Neither of them had ever had an interview go like this. They'd never seen anyone discuss their secret desire to rape and kill so easily, especially when they were claiming they didn't do anything. There was no question in their minds that Eric was their best lead by far, but they also knew that they couldn't arrest him just because he had dark and violent thoughts. So they just hoped when the DNA results came in, they would have a clearer idea if Eric was the killer. But in the meantime, they wanted to get a better idea of Corey's last few hours alive. So they talked to some of her friends and eventually tracked down Tiffany Zienta, Corey's friend who had been at the Ritz with her on the night before Thanksgiving, and as far as police knew, was the last person to see Corey alive. In the week following Corey's murder, Kingston and Carlisle sat down with Tiffany in the same interview room where they had met with Eric. But the situation was a lot more relaxed, and the detectives told Tiffany they were just trying to get a better picture of Corey's movements on the night before Thanksgiving. Tiffany told them she had met Corey at the club and said they went there together a lot. And then, without any prompting, Tiffany started talking about how beautiful Corey was and what an amazing person she was, and how being around her was just different than being around other people. The detective smiled, nodded, and listened, but both of them thought the same thing. It was completely normal for someone to talk about how great and how pretty one of their friends was, but something in the way Tiffany spoke about Corey felt different than that. So when Tiffany stopped talking, Kingston asked if she and Corey had been more than just friends. Did they ever have an intimate relationship? But Tiffany shook her head and almost laughed. She said no, she and Corey were just really good friends, they had a lot in common, and they loved hanging out together. Then Kingston asked when Tiffany had last seen Corey. At this, Tiffany lowered her head, and it was clear she was starting to cry. She said they left the club sometime around 1:30 a.m., and she asked Corey to go have some late-night drinks with her and a few other friends, but Corey had said she just wanted to go home. Tiffany said she called Corey around 2:15 a.m. just to make sure she had gotten home safely, but nobody answered. Tiffany figured Corey had already gone to bed, and so that's why she didn't try calling back again. The detectives thanked Tiffany for coming in and told her they would follow up with her soon. Tiffany said she would do everything she could to help, and then she left. But in the days following the interview, the detectives worked with the phone company and retrieved all of Corey's recent phone records, and despite what Tiffany had said, there was no record of her calling Corey at 2:15 a.m. or any time after they supposedly left the club. And so after finding that out, Kingston and Carlisle wanted to speak to Tiffany again right away. But when they called Tiffany, they discovered she had left town, and soon after that, they were told by the lawyer she'd just hired that Tiffany would no longer help with their investigation. Detectives Kingston and Carlisle spent the next few weeks pursuing any lead that might provide more information on the obsessed dishwasher Eric or on Corey's friend Tiffany. And they had conversations with a lot of different people that made both of their suspects seem totally viable. But the detectives still did not have any concrete evidence linking either suspect to the crime scene or to Corey's murder. Then, Kingston and Carlisle finally got the test results back that they had been waiting for from the crime lab. And these tests showed that DNA from the hair found on Corey's underwear and from the blood on the kitchen counter and the outside kitchen windowsill belonged to the same person. And that person was not Corey. But the DNA did not match any samples the crime lab had on file or any samples that had been entered into the FBI's national DNA database. So this meant the police had proof that another person had been in Corey's apartment on the night she was killed, but they had no idea who that person was. Still, Kingston and Carlisle thought they were getting close to finding the killer, and after several more interviews, they believed they had zeroed in on one particular suspect and that they had enough proof to arrest someone. However, the district attorney did not agree. He told them that without proof of who the DNA found in the house belonged to, or some other smoking gun, this case would never hold up in court. This news from the district attorney felt like a gut punch to Kingston and Carlisle, and no matter who they talked to or what information they got, they could not find the type of evidence that would enable them to make an arrest. And so the investigation started to slow down, and Kingston and Carlisle started to run out of options. The case remained open, but it was no longer the department's top priority, and Kingston and Carlisle had to focus on other work. In late May of 2000, about 18 months after Corey's murder, a man named William Rensler sat on the dock of a lake near Jacksonville Beach, fishing with two of his friends. Rensler referred to himself as a fugitive specialist, but most people called him a bounty hunter. Rensler had tracked down criminals and bail jumpers, and he was skilled at finding people who had seemingly disappeared. Recently, Jacksonville Beach police had put up a reward of $20,000 for anyone who could provide information that would lead to an arrest in Corey's murder. And once Rensler started looking into the past investigation, he became confident he could close the case, bring Corey's family some peace, and collect the reward money. Rensler laid his fishing rod down on the dock. He grabbed a beer from a cooler sitting next to him, he cracked it open, and then pulled out a thick file folder from his leather bag. He sipped from his beer and started looking over his notes on Corey's murder. Rensler's two friends, like everybody in town, knew about the case. They took a seat next to Rensler on the dock, they each grabbed a beer too, and asked him how it was going. Was he close to finding the killer? Rensler said he had interviewed a bunch of people connected to the case, but there was one person he really wanted to talk to that he just couldn't find. He pointed to this person's name in his notes, and both of his friends almost spit out their drinks. Rensler asked what was going on, and his friends said they both knew the person he was looking for because they had worked with them at a restaurant, and they told Rensler there was something really weird about this person. Rensler's friends said this person had come into the restaurant one day and said they had to quit and leave town immediately because their child had tragically died in Texas. Rensler asked, what was so weird about that? That sounded horrible. But one of his friends said he had gotten to know this person pretty well, and he was almost positive that they did not have children. Rensler took a swig of his beer and then asked his friends if they remembered when all this happened. And one of them said, this person he was looking for had left town around Thanksgiving about 1.5 years ago, not long after Corey Parker's murder. It would take a couple of months, but Rensler, the fugitive specialist, tracked down this person who had skipped town soon after Corey's murder. Rensler had traced their movements to Texas and then eventually discovered they had moved to a town in Maryland about 800 miles away from Jacksonville Beach. Once Rensler had this information, he informed detectives Kingston and Carlisle where this possible suspect was now living, and the detectives caught the next flight to Maryland to try to secure a DNA sample. On July 26, 2000, so 20 months after Corey's murder, Kingston and Carlisle sat in an unmarked car in Easton, Maryland, with a local police officer. The detectives were watching the suspect who was smoking a cigarette in a parking lot while on a break from work. And Kingston and Carlisle could not believe their luck. A discarded cigarette butt was perfect for getting a DNA sample, because the suspect's spit and saliva would be all over it. And so they watched their suspect smoke for several minutes, and when it looked like the cigarette was about to be out and they might flick it onto the ground, they felt this surge of adrenaline. But then, Kingston and Carlisle watched in horror as the suspect carefully put the cigarette out on the ground and then slipped the butt behind their ear. The detectives looked at each other. The suspect very likely knew they were being tailed by the police. The suspect turned to walk back into work, but before opening the door, they leaned down a little and spit on the ground. Kingston and Carlisle practically wanted to start cheering. They waited for the suspect to go inside, and then Carlisle got out of the car, ran across the parking lot, collected the spit off the ground, and ran back to the car. A little bit later, Kingston, Carlisle, and local police officers delivered that sample to the FBI's DNA lab, which is only about 70 miles from where they were. And when the FBI conducted their tests, they were able to match the DNA from the suspect's spit to the DNA samples taken from the hair and blood found in Corey's apartment. The fugitive specialist, the bounty hunter, William Rensler, had indeed led the detectives right to Corey's killer. Based on DNA testing, crime scene evidence, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Corey Parker in the early morning hours of November 28, 1998. At about 2 a.m., the killer crept towards Corey's apartment, trying their best to stay low and out of any lights that were shining from people's porches and balconies. The killer made their way around Corey's apartment to the kitchen window, and it was still open. So, quietly, the killer climbed in through the window and into the kitchen. The whole apartment was dark, but the killer knew their way around well enough. So they walked through the front room and down a short hallway to Corey's bedroom. They reached the bedroom door, and it was cracked open. The killer took a breath and opened the door just a little more and stepped into the bedroom. In the light coming through the window, the killer could see Corey sleeping in her bed, and they saw Corey's underwear laying near her leg on top of the comforter. The killer got excited and started breathing heavily. Then suddenly, Corey woke up. She heard someone breathing and saw a shadow near the foot of her bed. But before she could scream, the killer lunged at the bed and ripped the comforter off of Corey. The killer could see she was naked, and they leapt on top of her. The killer pinned Corey down, but Corey's arms were long and she was fast, and she fought back. The killer didn't see it, but in the struggle, their gold cigarette lighter tumbled out of their pocket and onto the floor. Corey slashed her hands and nails at the killer and cut into the palm of their hand and ripped at their hair. Then the killer grabbed Corey's head and slammed it against the headboard. With Corey suddenly stunned and woozy, the killer reached down and covered her mouth with one hand and reached around and grabbed the knife out of their pocket with the other. Then the killer raised the knife, and Corey put up her arms to try to defend herself, but the killer just cut at her arms, knocking them out of the way. Then the killer raised the knife again and stabbed Corey in the chest. The killer pulled the knife back up and stabbed her in the chest again and again, and Corey's body went limp and slumped against the headboard. But the killer did not stop. They kept stabbing as blood splashed onto the wall and ran down Corey's body onto the bed. Finally, the killer did stop, and they looked down at Corey. They had just stabbed her 101 times. The killer climbed off the bed and staggered back. They could barely think or see straight, but they made their way out of the bedroom and through the apartment. They walked into the kitchen, steadied themselves on the counter for a second, and then they climbed through the open window, leaving a little bit of blood on the windowsill. Once outside, the killer crouched back down and rushed through the darkness to the apartment building right behind Corey's. It would turn out the obsessed dishwasher, Eric, who had admitted to having fantasies about rape and murder, did not kill Corey. And neither did her close friend Tiffany, who police thought might have been infatuated with Corey. In fact, the killer was not somebody who police had suspected early on. It was a 17-year-old named Robert Denny, Corey's teenage neighbor who often hung out on his second-floor balcony in the apartment building right behind Corey's. Robert was not the peeping Tom who had been spotted in the area, but he did spend a lot of time spying on Corey. From his balcony, he could watch her in her apartment or when she went out to sit on her back porch. Police had talked to Robert when they talked to Corey's other neighbors, but he didn't seem to know her, and his age played in his favor. Police simply didn't believe that this crime had been carried out by a teenager. But when police later discovered that Robert had left town not long after the murder, they did start to reconsider their thoughts about him. And they even wanted to arrest him, but the district attorney did not believe they had enough evidence to make the case stick. When the fugitive expert, William Rensler, learned from his friends that Robert had given a really bizarre reason for leaving town so soon after Corey's murder, Rensler became convinced that Robert had killed Corey. Soon, Rensler tracked Robert down and told Detectives Kingston and Carlisle everything he had learned about the young man. And so, the detectives headed to Maryland and secured the DNA sample from Robert's spit that matched with the DNA samples found inside of Corey's apartment. In addition to those samples, one of Robert's ex-girlfriends came forward and told police that the gold cigarette lighter found in Corey's apartment belonged to Robert. And finally, detectives discovered that Robert's own brother was in a Texas prison for murdering a woman by stabbing her 98 times. And authorities came to believe that by stabbing Corey 101 times, Robert was just trying to outdo his brother. Robert was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, he maintains his innocence. On the hot evening of September 20th, 1987, 37-year-old Maria Ferreira hosted a lively family gathering at her small home in Goiânia, Brazil. Goiânia was a cosmopolitan city with nearly 1 million people. Gleaming skyscrapers and tropical fruit trees lined the wealthy downtown area. But there were also areas of extreme poverty. Maria and her husband, Davayer, lived in one of these lower-income neighborhoods where they owned and operated a scrapyard on their property. It was hard work, especially in the intense tropical heat. But Maria and Davayer made a great team. Maria liked to joke that even though Davayer was short and stocky, he always had his head in the clouds. Davayer would tease Maria when she took things too seriously, saying that that was why she had a gray streak in her long brown hair. But on this night, Maria was totally relaxed. There was plenty of delicious food and drink with people she loved, and they were able to pay for it because they had a little extra money from selling more scrap metal than usual. Maria and Davayer had also acquired a rare good luck charm a few days earlier. They never had much in the way of material possessions, but they tried to find beauty in their everyday life. This time, it was in a trinket Davayer had found. As they passed it around the table, she felt grateful for all the good fortune that had come their way. In the chair next to Maria, Davayer scooped a spoonful of black bean and pork stew onto his plate. He was listening to his brother, who was a bus driver, tell a story. He always had something funny to share from one of his routes. Davayer's other brother, Ivo, was there as well with his wife and their 6-year-old daughter, Lei Ji. The little girl's big brown eyes and joyful laugh filled Maria with love. Lei Ji was the closest thing she had had to a daughter since she didn't have any children of her own. It was the perfect night, and that called for a toast. Once everyone refilled their glasses, Maria raised hers in the air and thanked her family for coming. They all cheered and drank to the future. Later, after everyone left, Davayer went into the garage to finish up some work. As Maria washed coffee cups and put away plates, she could hear thunder in the distance. The next morning, on September 21st, Maria woke to the sound of rain pelting her tin rooftop. Goiânia's rainy season normally ran from October to April, but this year it had started earlier than usual. As Maria climbed out of bed, she noticed that she didn't feel well. Her body was stiff and her stomach felt upset. She wrote off her discomfort to the previous night's festivities and tried to carry on with her day. But as time passed, Maria was starting to feel increasingly sick until finally, after a few hours, she started violently vomiting. Now, the pain in Maria's stomach was so bad that she decided she needed to see a doctor right away. She slowly got dressed and walked out to tell Davayer. Maria found him working in the scrapyard. It was cluttered with old refrigerators, large pieces of sheet metal, and disassembled machines. Davayer offered to take her, but she said she didn't want to distract him from his work, so she told him she could get there on her own. Maria took a bus to a nearby hospital and was able to see a doctor right away. After the doctor examined her, he said everything was fine. She must be having an allergic reaction to something she ate. Maria was relieved it wasn't something more serious. She found it hard to believe she could be this sick from food she was used to eating, but the doctor reassured her and said to go home and rest and she would feel better soon. But that evening, Maria still felt just as sick. She called her mom, who lived in a neighboring town, and asked her to come stay for a few days. Maria's mother took a bus there right away, and once she got there, she did her best to nurse her daughter back to health, feeding her broth and herbs, but whatever Maria had caught, it just wasn't going away. Even worse, Maria's mother soon started to feel sick too, with the same symptoms of fever and upset stomach that Maria had. So 2 days later, Maria's mom had to return back to her home to rest and recuperate as well. Maria was confused. If she was suffering from a food allergy like the doctor thought, why would her mom have gotten sick too? So now she thought maybe she'd come down with the flu and her mother had just caught it from her. So when her brother-in-law, Ivo, stopped by the house on September 24th, Maria tried to keep her distance from him. She'd been sick for 4 days and didn't want to risk passing anything on. Ivo didn't stay long at Maria and Davayer's house.
and soon he got back to his own home right in time for lunch. His wife had put out some egg sandwiches, and after Ivo and his wife had sat down to eat, they called in their daughter, Leiji, to come join them. But Leiji was having too much fun playing with her dolls, her glitter, and her coloring books. Finally, Leiji did abandon her toys and took her seat at the table with her parents. But just 10 minutes after eating, Leiji threw up. Then, later that afternoon, Ivo and his wife got sick too. At first, they thought it was the eggs they had for lunch, but Ivo soon realized this wasn't just a case of food poisoning. It seemed like almost everyone who had gone to the Ferreira household recently was getting sick. And by now, that included De Valliere, who was feeling nauseous, as well as his mother, who had come by to visit. The list grew to include 2 of De Valliere's brothers and a handful of their children. The sickness had even spread to several of the neighbors who had visited with Maria and De Valliere. 2 of De Valliere's scrapyard employees had also become ill, all in the span of a week. When Maria found out about the growing number of people who were getting sick, she was horrified, and she became even more afraid when she noticed something else very disturbing. There were these red lesions that were showing up on her skin that were painful to the touch. By September 27th, nearly a week after first getting sick, Maria's stomach pain was unbearable. As she lay curled up in bed listening to the rain falling outside, she thought back to that last night she felt healthy. It was the same night she had hosted the big family gathering. Maria tried to remember everything she had done that night. Then she realized something. There was only one thing that everyone who had gotten sick over the last 10 days had in common. Maria could barely move, but she knew what she had to do next. If she didn't get to the bottom of this mystery, her whole family could be in serious danger. And so, on the next morning, she willed herself out of bed and slowly managed to get dressed. Then she gathered the evidence she needed in a cloth sack. Maria knew where she wanted to take it, and it wasn't to the hospital where she'd been before. She was going somewhere that had the authority to help her. The only issue was, she needed someone to go with her. She was too exhausted to make the trip on her own. De Valliere wasn't feeling well enough to go with her, so she asked another scrapyard employee to accompany her. Maria let the young man carry the bag she'd packed. She was so weak she could barely keep moving. Just down the street, they boarded a crowded bus, and about a half hour later, they got off near an office called the Vigilancia Sanitaria. This was a public health agency that regulated pharmaceuticals, food products, and sanitary conditions. It was basically the Brazilian equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Maria thought that if anybody could figure out what was making her and her family so sick, it would be someone at this agency. She and her companion entered the plain brick building through a courtyard and were taken into the office belonging to the agency's director. The young man helping Maria dropped the bag he was carrying on the official's desk. Then Maria wiped her flushed face with a handkerchief and explained what it was. She said the contents of the bag were killing her family. The official just stared at her. He looked inside the bag and seemed confused. The items inside didn't look particularly dangerous. He said what really concerned him was Maria. Maria knew she was sweating and visibly shaking, and she noticed his expression as he looked at all the lesions and burn-like marks on her arms. The official told her that right now, she just needed to see a doctor, but he did promise he would take a closer look at what was in the bag. And, just to be safe, the official put the bag on a chair in the building's courtyard, then made sure Maria knew how to get to the nearest health clinic. Maria was skeptical. The last time she'd seen a doctor, he'd given her the wrong diagnosis, but she didn't know what else to do, so she and her companion left the agency and headed to the bus stop. Maria insisted that her companion return to the scrapyard and get back to work. Unsure and scared about what she would find out, Maria boarded the bus alone. A short time later, a doctor at this clinic carefully examined Maria and then gave her a new diagnosis. He said she was right. She was not experiencing an allergic reaction or food poisoning. What she had was a tropical disease, and her family and friends who were sick probably had it too. He explained that the unusually heavy rains had been spawning mosquitoes and a host of other bugs that carried infectious diseases. A virus like dengue or Zika would explain her symptoms, including the burn-like lesions she'd developed. The doctor assured Maria that this was all very manageable and that everything would be okay. Then he arranged to have her transported to the Tropical Diseases Hospital for specialized treatment. Maria's unease lightened, and she even managed a weak smile. She finally had a real explanation for what was happening to her and her family. It was a relief to think that the bag she had left at the health agency didn't actually have anything to do with a tropical virus. Less than an hour later, Maria arrived at the Tropical Diseases Hospital. As a doctor took her vitals, she asked if he knew what type of virus was going around. But instead of answering her question, the doctor gently took her arm and began closely examining her skin lesions. Then he called one of the nurses over to look at them. The nurse said she'd seen some other patients with similar burns in the last few days. Suddenly, the doctor's face turned serious, which made Maria extremely nervous. He continued to examine her, and then he stepped back. He explained that the doctor at the previous health clinic had been wrong too. Maria's symptoms did not line up with any kind of tropical disease he'd ever treated. In fact, this doctor was afraid Maria's symptoms were connected to another sickness entirely, and if he was even partially correct, they would need to move quickly. This could be a dangerous situation. The doctor asked her detailed questions about the past several days, and Maria shared everything she could remember. She could see the alarm spread across his face the more they talked. Maria felt a terrible wave of panic and nausea start to wash over her, and then she felt like she needed to tell him about the bag. So she explained that she had brought this bag and left it at the public health agency in hopes that they would analyze it. As soon as she said this, the doctor quickly excused himself and ran as fast as he could to the phone. He called a physician at the state's Department of the Environment. He tried to hide the rising panic in his voice as he explained the urgency of the situation and that action needed to be taken immediately. Both doctors agreed that the bag Maria brought to the public health office had to be examined as soon as possible to prevent the spread of what was making everyone sick. The doctor at the Department of the Environment knew a specialist named Walter Ferreira. Dr. Ferreira, who had no relation to Maria and her family, would be able to properly analyze the bag's contents. But because it was late in the evening, they wouldn't be able to contact him until the next day. Early the next morning, Dr. Ferreira was getting dressed when his phone rang. It was the doctor from the Department of the Environment calling. Dr. Ferreira paced anxiously as he learned what was going on. There was a huge crisis taking place in Goiânia, and he needed to act quickly. He scribbled down the address to the public health office where the bag was, and then ran out the door and went to a nearby office to grab some equipment. He hoped his colleague at the Department of the Environment was wrong about everything, because if he wasn't, that meant thousands of lives were now in danger. About an hour later, Dr. Ferreira arrived at the public health office. Before he entered the courtyard, he pulled a device out of a case. The device would reveal if their terrible suspicions were correct. He carefully switched on the piece of equipment, but right away it seemed like the device was malfunctioning. And no matter how much Dr. Ferreira struggled to adjust the equipment, it just wouldn't work. The readings were just so impossible that he assumed it had to be broken. Dr. Ferreira was frustrated. Now he would need to go back to his office and swap out this broken device for a new one. So he let the receptionist know he'd be back as soon as possible. Almost 2 hours later, Dr. Ferreira returned with a replacement piece of equipment. When he turned that one on, the exact same thing happened. The readings were impossible. He tried turning it on and off several times, but he just kept getting these totally incredible readings. After a few minutes, Dr. Ferreira was horrified to realize that he had been wrong. Both of these devices had been working perfectly fine, and that meant the reality of this situation was much, much worse. If this situation didn't get handled, the whole city of Goiânia could have a catastrophic health crisis on their hands, and maybe all of Brazil could have a health crisis on their hands. So Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to get to that bag. Dr. Ferreira ran inside the building and was met by the facility's director. Ferreira asked where this bag was, but the director explained that he had become concerned about the bag's contents, so he had called in the fire brigade for assistance. In fact, the firefighters were already there and were about to take the bag from the building's courtyard. Their plan was to dispose of it in a nearby stream. Dr. Ferreira ran into the courtyard and saw a group of firefighters surrounding the bag. He yelled for them to stop, and that if they threw it in the water, it would trigger a horrific disaster. He warned them not to touch it and insisted that everyone just evacuate the building. Once Dr. Ferreira was able to explain what was happening, the firefighters realized just how serious this situation was, and they helped him clear the area. But the day was far from over. Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to track down Maria and speak to her about the contents of this bag. He located her at a hospital, but her condition had now worsened to the point where she was just too weak to even talk. But she was able to instruct Dr. Ferreira to just go to her family's junkyard, where he would find her husband, and he could answer any questions the doctor might have. It was noon by the time Dr. Ferreira and his colleague got to Maria and Devaillier's scrapyard. When they arrived, they saw Devaillier working next to his garage. Dr. Ferreira introduced himself and tried to shake Devaillier's hand, but Devaillier politely refused, and then he showed them the inside of his hand, and there was this huge open sore on his palm. Dr. Ferreira looked at it and then immediately shot a look of worry at his colleague. The doctor knew this type of wound on Devaillier's hand could only be caused by one thing, and it was the thing that Dr. Ferreira feared the most. Devaillier told them that this whole situation began 11 days earlier on September 18th. That morning, around 10 a.m., a young man had stopped by their scrapyard and told him about some scrap metal he'd found and wanted to sell. He had never seen anything like it and thought it was valuable. Devaillier said he was interested and told the young man to bring it over. Later that day, the young man returned, now hauling something in a wheelbarrow. Inside this wheelbarrow were the disassembled pieces of a large metal contraption. There was also a small capsule shaped like an oversized thermos. Devaillier thought both items were made of stainless steel, which would earn him a nice profit. But after Devaillier examined the capsule more closely, he became even more excited. It was lined with lead, which was an even more valuable metal. Devaillier paid the man the equivalent of about $30 and brought his new purchases into his garage. He left them there before heading inside to eat dinner. Once he was done eating, he headed back to the garage to start extracting the lead. But when Devaillier opened back up the garage doors, he was amazed by what he now saw inside. A strange blue glow was now coming from the thermos-shaped capsule. Devaillier was a deeply spiritual man and thought he might have encountered something supernatural. He grabbed the metal capsule and called Maria into the garage so she could see it too. When Maria saw its unusual glow, she was just as mystified as Devaillier. They took a closer look and saw that the blue light was coming through a small window on the side of the capsule. The window looked like it had already been punctured with a screwdriver, probably by the young man who had just sold it to Devaillier. Maria thought there could be a priceless gemstone hidden inside, but Devaillier was sure that it was actually a holy relic that would bring blessings and good fortune to the family. Devaillier was determined to continue examining this object. So he poked around the small opening with a screwdriver and removed what appeared to be several small pellets of a glittery bluish powder. The pellets were part of a slightly bigger pile that still sat deep inside the capsule. For all Devaillier knew, this luminous powder could be worth thousands of dollars. It could change their lives in a way they'd never imagined. As Devaillier told the doctors of this discovery, he remembered how special he felt handling the powder, and he wanted his whole family to experience it. This was the good luck charm they shared at their big family dinner. Over the next few days, Devaillier shared his discovery with more family and friends and neighbors, and each time someone came over, he brought out the special glitter. Small groups of people gathered around the capsule and peered through the broken window to admire the glowing powder inside. Many touched the small pellets Devayer had extracted. Seeing how excited everyone was about the powder made Devayer determined to extract the rest of it from the capsule. So a friend came over and, using a screwdriver, helped him remove fragments from behind the glass window. Eventually, they did get it all out. The entire pile was small enough to fit in the palm of Devayer's hand. Once all the powder had been extracted, Devayer gave the capsule to 2 of his employees and asked them to melt it down for metal and sell it to a nearby scrapyard. Then he brought some of the powder to Maria, who in turn dusted it all over her pajamas and bed sheets. Devayer gave a grain-sized fragment to his brother, the bus driver, who rubbed it on his hands before heading into work. And on his shift as a bus driver, he came into contact with dozens of people. Another one of Devayer's brothers dipped his finger in the blue powder and traced a cross on his abdomen for divine protection. Maria's mother handled some of the powder while she was taking care of Maria, and then she too became ill. Around that same time, Devayer had given some fragments to his brother Ivo, and later, Ivo's daughter, Leiji, played with the glittery crystals and rubbed them all over her hands and arms. And then immediately after doing that, she had eaten her egg sandwich and become ill right away. Devayer also shared his good luck charm with several neighbors, who began having symptoms as well. After Maria had spent days wondering what might have caused so many people to get sick so quickly, she finally realized they all had one thing in common. They all had come in contact with this mysterious blue powder. So, on the morning of September 28th, 10 days after buying this capsule, Maria told Devayer she was taking what was left of the powder and the capsule to the local health agency to be analyzed. She placed these remnants in a large cloth bag, then she headed out with one of Devayer's employees to retrieve the parts of the capsule that had been sold to the other scrapyards. She managed to collect most of it. Those were also placed in the bag that Maria brought to the public health office. The story confirmed Dr. Ferreira's worst fears. He asked Devayer about the young man who first sold him the capsule and where he'd gotten it. Devayer said he wasn't sure, but he thought it might have come from some sort of abandoned facility that was located nearby. Dr. Ferreira turned to his colleague and saw that the other doctor's face had now gone white, because he knew exactly where that capsule had come from. It was a clinic that had closed 2 years earlier, a cancer treatment clinic. The capsule had come from a radiation therapy machine, and the magical blue powder that was inside wasn't from a precious gemstone. The powder was a highly radioactive material called cesium-137. When properly contained in the capsule, the powder's destructive capabilities could be used for focused cancer treatments, but without that protective shell, the powder became one of the most lethal substances on Earth. Maria and the others were not suffering from a tropical disease or any of the other things that doctors first thought. They were experiencing massive radiation poisoning, and the lesions they had developed were radiation burns. The handful of powder that Devayer found was enough to make more than 200 people extremely ill and place thousands more in danger. Dr. Ferreira knew all this because he was a medical physicist, and the tool he had tried to use outside of the public health agency was a radiation detector. He thought both detectors were broken because they were making so much noise and their readings were so high they were literally off the charts. But the detectors were correct. They were reading such high levels of radiation in the vicinity of where this bag was that contained the powder that the federal government would have to get involved. And now that Dr. Ferreira had confirmed just how serious the situation had become, he contacted Brazil's Nuclear Energy Commission. Within a matter of hours, they started testing thousands of Goiânia's residents for radiation poisoning in the city's sports stadium. On the morning of September 30th, 13 days after Devayer bought the capsule, workers in hazmat suits arrived in the courtyard of the health agency to properly dispose of the bag that contained the radioactive material. The abandoned cancer clinic where the blue powder was first discovered was demolished as well. On October 23rd, Maria Ferreira finally died. Her niece, Leiji, also died on the same day. They were each buried in special fiberglass, lead-lined coffins to prevent radiation from leaking out. By the end of the month, de Bayer's 2 young employees also died as a result of the exposure they had received when they melted down the capsule for de Bayer. While Maria's husband, de Bayer, survived the tragedy, he never mentally recovered. De Bayer died in 1994, 7 years later. Thankfully, no one else died from the radiation exposure, but many others sustained amputations, severe burn scars, and lifelong medical conditions. The Goiânia incident remains one of history's deadliest disasters involving medical radiation.
A little after 3 p.m. on March 22, 1959, a 20-year-old British college student named Neil Moss stood in a cavern about 1,000 feet underground in northern England. And as he stood there, he was staring with excitement into this dark hole right in front of him. The cavern that Neil was standing inside of was known as Peak Cavern, and it was one of the biggest and most twisting cave systems in the entire country. In fact, it was so big that at one point, an entire village of 30 rope makers lived inside of this cave. And then also, after those rope makers, the cave system became a hideout for criminals and thieves because there were so many secret passageways and basically places to hide inside of this system. So basically, Peak Cavern was a pretty famous place. And as a result, basically all of it had been mapped out or at least explored by scientists and spelunkers, except for this hole right in front of Neil. It was an entrance to a tunnel that nobody even knew about. Neil and the amateur exploration group that he was a part of had discovered this entryway about 2 weeks earlier. Now, neither Neil nor anybody else in this group had actually gone into this hole yet, and the reason for that was it was pretty dangerous. I mean, the opening to this tunnel was pretty small. It was 1.5 feet by 2 feet wide at the opening, and just looking down into it, I mean, it's a dark hole that you really can't tell how tight or how far it even goes. And so once you went inside of it, the deeper you got, the higher the risk of entrapment. And so whoever actually went into this hole really needed to be prepared. But Neil and the rest of his amateur exploration group really felt like it would be worth it to try to go down this tunnel. Not just because nobody had done it before, but specifically, they thought there was a chance that beyond this tunnel, basically deep underground, if you followed it long enough, it could lead to another big open chamber that nobody had found before. And those types of big open chambers, whoever finds them gets it named after them. And so Neil and his group were thinking, hey, if we find this big chamber, it'll be named after us. We'll be famous, at least in, spelunking circles. But they also understood that there might be nothing at the other end of this tunnel. It could just be a dead end. But the only way to know for sure would be if one of the members of this group went into the hole. Now, in addition to a fear of being trapped in the hole, there were other big issues with blindly crawling into a tunnel no one's been in before. Like, for example, there could be a sudden drop-off, or running water, or some other hazard that whoever went into the hole wouldn't know about until they were facing it. And so naturally, everybody in this group was excited about the hole, but also a little apprehensive about being the guinea pig to actually go into the hole. And so after the group had kind of stood around the hole for a minute, kind of talking through who was going to do it, Neil had finally courageously volunteered to be the guinea pig. He would go down. And in many ways, Neil was kind of like the perfect candidate for this job. He was smart, he was strong, and most importantly, he was thin, which meant he could navigate a really tight space. The only drawback to Neil was he was pretty tall. He was over 6 feet. And generally speaking, the best cavers in the world are very short and thin because it allows them to get into the smallest, tightest spaces underground. And so Neil, who was standing over the hole, began to mentally prepare himself for what he was about to do. He pulled out his flashlight and he shined it straight down into this hole, which again is a pretty narrow hole, and it basically went straight down. And as he was shining it, he saw about 12 feet down, the hole kind of turned and you couldn't see what was beyond it. And so Neil knew the only part of this trip he would know about is that first 12 feet. Once he made that turn, everything beyond that was totally unknown. Literally no one in the world knew what was beyond it. But Neil was about to find out. The cave explorers anchored this 75-foot-long wire ladder that was all rolled up to this rock that was inside the cavern right near the opening to this hole. Once that was in place, they spooled out the ladder and kind of dumped it down into the hole. And so it fell 12 feet down and landed right where this tunnel turned and sort of went into oblivion, where nobody knows what happened after that. And so Neil, his job was going to be to go into this hole feet first, go down 12 feet, and then with his feet, as he kind of blindly crawled backwards feet first into the tunnel, he'd be kicking with his feet this ladder, extending it farther and farther into this tunnel. The idea was this ladder was his way back out again. So he's basically on top of the ladder, making his way, and at any point he can just grab the ladder and climb back out again. And so once the ladder was in place and all the cave explorers were kind of waiting for Neil walked up to the edge of the hole, he took a deep breath, and then he swung one leg into the hole, placed it on one of the rungs of the ladder, put his other leg on the ladder as well, and kind of tested it to make sure the rock that was anchoring the ladder could hold his weight. Once he was sure it could, he said goodbye to the explorers and then began his descent, feet first, down into the hole. As Neil slowly and carefully climbed down this ladder during this first 12-foot section, he felt the walls of this hole closing in on him. When he was close to the bottom of this first section, the walls were literally flush with his shoulders and back. I mean, this was a really tight space. And so finally he got to the very bottom of this 12-foot section, and he was about to step onto what he thought was another rung, because he can't actually see where he's going. He's just using his feet to feel. And he stepped down and he felt something hard. It was the ground. So he had reached the bottom of the 12-foot section. He kind of tested the ground with his foot, seeing if it would support his weight. And after feeling confident, he stepped off the ladder and just stood at the bottom of the hole. At this point, Neil used his feet to kick the ladder that was still coiled up at the bottom of the hole into the next turn, into the next section of the tunnel that he'd be going down. And as soon as he kicked it, he heard it kind of spool out as it tumbled down this next section. However, it was not a straight drop like this first section was. This next section he'd be going into was more of a gradual decline, just based on the sound this ladder was making as it tumbled down. And so after the ladder had stopped making noise and he knew it had stopped, Neil gave one final look up at his friends above, gave them a little wave, even though he could barely move his hands because it's so tight around him, and then he got down on his stomach and feet first began shimmying himself down into this next section. Now, during the first 12 feet and during the initial turn into this new section, Neil had been able to turn his head and basically look down and see where his feet were going. But after only a few feet of going into this new section, the walls had become so tight on his body that he couldn't even move his head. He really was blind and had no idea where he was going. Now, for a lot of people, this would have been a claustrophobic nightmare. Neil is in this unbelievably tight space. He has no idea what's gonna happen next. He doesn't know if it's gonna get so tight he'll get wedged in there. It's cold, it's damp. I mean, it's pitch black in there. He does have a headlamp, but his head is like kind of pressed to the ground and he can't really move it. So, he's not really able to look around him. And periodically, as he was shimmying his way down deeper into this tunnel, he would dislodge rocks from the wall and he would hear them strike the wall as they tumbled down into oblivion. He had no idea if these rocks were tumbling into a dead end or if they were tumbling off a ledge somewhere, a ledge that he wouldn't be aware of until he got to it. But for Neil, this environment was something he thrived in. It was why he was so drawn to cave exploration. As much as cave exploring was a physical exercise and a physical test, it was much more a mental test. I mean, can you handle being in these tight spaces and persevering and continuing on when you're all by yourself and it's like dangers all around you? And also, Neil just loved being alone and in the dark. So cave exploration was like perfect for him. When Neil had made it about 10 feet down this new section, his feet touched the rolled up section of the ladder. And so with his toes, he kind of gave it a kick and the ladder tumbled for a second and he could hear it. And then it just kind of vanished altogether, like the ladder had gone over a cliff. And so Neil realized, very likely, just beyond his feet, even though he cannot see it, is a ledge, and very likely either a drop-off or a new cavern. The thing they hope is on the other end of this tunnel. And so this was exciting for Neil. He felt a rush of adrenaline. There's a new turn in the tunnel, and for all he knows, this is the cavern they're looking for. Or it's just another section of tunnel he would have to explore. But either way, he's making progress. And so Neil very carefully scooched backwards until he felt the edge, at which point he let his legs go over the edge, he found his footing on the ladder, and it was at this point when he kind of turned around a little bit that he could see this was not some big open cavern he had found. It was just a turn in the tunnel system. It was now going back to basically a vertical hole, big enough to fit inside of, but Neil has no idea how deep it goes or what it leads to. But Neil was totally undeterred. He lowered his whole body into the section, got on the ladder, and began descending.
And very quickly, as he began this descent, the walls of this section, this new vertical section, were so tight, it was about 18 inches in diameter, that he actually couldn't just go straight down. His body didn't fit just trying to maneuver down. So the only way he could get himself to go down further was to shimmy himself side to side like a corkscrew, basically forcing his body deeper and deeper into this hole. And so Neil continued doing this for an additional 18 feet down in this new section of tunnel, which put him at a total of 40 feet down into this tunnel from the entrance where the rest of his friends were. And when he got down there, 18 feet down, he went to step onto the rung to continue his descent, but his foot hit rock. And he felt around with his feet, and he realized this tunnel did not lead to a big new chamber. It instead was a dead end after all. Now, just to be sure, Neil actually kicked as hard as he could. He's kind of restricted, but he kicked with his legs as much as he could to see if maybe this wasn't a true dead end. Maybe it was just an obstruction and he could clear it. But he could tell, after a few stomps, this was not moving. This really was the end. Now, part of Neil was disappointed because he was hoping that by doing this, they would discover this big new chamber and they'd get it named after them. But on the other hand, he was also relieved because by this point, it was extremely claustrophobic, even for a guy who thrived in this environment. By the bottom of this 40-foot section, he is completely wedged in place. And so Neil decided it was time to head back to the surface. But from where he was at, he couldn't even hear his friends. He's way down deep in this tunnel. It's totally pitch black. And so what he needed to do was just begin climbing back up this ladder. And then, about halfway up, he could call up to his friends and tell them, hey, I'm returning. But remember, to get to where Neil is, he has literally forced his body down into this tiny hole, basically corkscrewing himself as deep as he could get. And so he's totally restricted, and his arms are basically by his side, and his hands are basically pinned in front of his body. And so Neil tried to grab the ladder, which is literally pressed up against his chest, to begin the ascent. But even though his fingers could touch the rungs of the ladder, he couldn't actually move his arms to pull himself up the ladder. He could just hold the rung. That was it. But Neil had been in similar situations before, and what you do is you just use your legs. You drive with your legs and push your body up until your arms can go above your head, and then you continue the ascent. However, his legs also were basically in the same situation. It was so unbelievably tight around his legs that he couldn't lift his legs up. He could just basically wiggle his feet. Basically, there was no way physically for Neil to get himself out. He would need his team up above to pull him out. And so Neil began shouting as loud as he could, trying to get the attention of his friends up above, telling them, hey, I'm stuck, pull me out. And then also, as best as he could with his hands on the rung, he kind of pulled on the ladder, signaling to them like, hey, get me out of here. Now, he couldn't really hear anything up above. It was sort of muffled, and he couldn't tell if they were yelling back down to him. But as he was holding onto the ladder, he felt a little bit of tension, suggesting they were pulling on him. However, as he held on, waiting to be pulled up and out, he didn't budge. Despite the tension on this ladder clearly coming from the surface from his friends, he wasn't moving. And that's when Neil realized he had made a critical mistake. When he had reached the bottom of this tunnel, when he realized it was a dead end, he had stomped with his feet to confirm it really was a dead end. And when he had done that, he had inadvertently kicked the rungs of this ladder into a crevice, and then rocks, which he had heard kind of falling when he was kicking, landed on top of it, basically pinning the ladder in place. Basically, this ladder was now anchored inside the cave, which meant no matter how hard his friends on the surface pulled, they would not be able to pull the ladder up, which meant they couldn't pull Neil up. And Neil, once he realized this was the issue, he tried to move his feet to clear the rocks off the bottom of the ladder, but he couldn't. It was too tight around him. And so Neil was totally stuck. The members of Neil's exploration group pretty much immediately realized this was a crisis, because not only was Neil stuck in this cave, but in these tight little tunnels underground, there's limited oxygen. So it's not just a matter of, we'll figure it out and get Neil out somehow. It's like, no, you have a limited amount of time before Neil runs out of oxygen down there. Even if you come up with a solution, it might be too late. And so immediately, members of the exploration group left Peak Cavern to go get help. And before long, over 200 people had flooded the cavern, including a mountain rescue unit and a coal mining extraction team and a whole bunch of civilians who who were all there to try to figure out how to get Neil out. Now, at first, Neil was very optimistic about his recovery. He could hear clearly all the commotion 40 feet above him. He couldn't fully discern what was going on there, but he could clearly tell a major rescue operation was afoot. And so as ropes were cast down and ladders were cast down to try to get him out, and they continued to fail, and as the air he was breathing began to thin out and it was getting harder to breathe, Neil's reaction was to kind of be positive. He actually began cracking jokes and calling up like, hey, how much longer do I have to wait down here? But as the minutes turned into hours and none of the efforts by any of the rescuers were working, Neil began to panic. His heart was racing, not only from his nerves, but also because he was running out of oxygen. He had begun to grit his teeth really hard to kind of control his fear, but he was really starting to lose it. At one point, the rescuers threw down an oxygen mask for him to breathe because it was clear the air was becoming a real issue. But even though the mask literally tumbled down and hit him right on the head, so it's right here, he couldn't get his arms up to put the mask on. And so there it is, salvation, but he couldn't use it. And so before long, Neil sort of began drifting in and out of consciousness. One moment he'd be calling up to his rescuers, asking for an update. The next, they'd call down to him and get no response. Clearly, this situation was becoming dire. Now, to this point, the way the rescue had gone was the rescuers were basically throwing equipment into the hole, be it ladders or ropes or oxygen masks for Neil to grab onto or put on him, and they were hoping that basically Neil could get himself out of the hole. Because the great fear was, if we send a rescuer, or rescuers plural, into this hole to get him, they could get stuck, and now we have an even bigger problem. But when Neil began losing consciousness, when they couldn't get him to call back to them, they knew they were genuinely running out of time. And so they began pumping oxygen into the hole to hopefully buy some extra time. And then they decided, we gotta send someone into the hole. Someone has to go in there, get Neil, and pull him out. And so one by one, these courageous rescuers went down into the hole, and 8 times they tried, and 8 times they failed. All 8 either got stuck along the way or they passed out along the way. 3 people actually reached Neil and actually touched Neil, but there was no way to grab him and pull him out. And so Neil, who was conscious for a lot of this, he's hearing and literally in some cases seeing rescue. It's right there, it's right in front of him, but it just didn't work. By the time the 8th man was pulled back out of the hole, they could hear in the hole this horrible sound, which was Neil gasping for air. Even though they were attempting to pump air into this hole, it wasn't enough, and Neil just couldn't fill his lungs with enough oxygen. And so the rescuers yelled into the hole for Neil to just hold on. They were gonna get him out of there, just be strong, hold on. But by this point, Neil, he wasn't even saying anything back. He just continued making these awful gasping sounds. By about 7 p.m., when Neil had been stuck in this hole for 4 hours, the rescuers decided to send one more guy into this hole, this really small civilian. And he went down there with a rope to attach around Neil and hopefully pull him out. And this little civilian managed to get all the way down, all the way to Neil. And when he found Neil, Neil was unconscious, but alive. And the rescuer put the rope around Neil's shoulders and then signaled to the surface to begin pulling. And so from the surface, they pulled on this rope, and slowly but surely, Neil began to be pulled out of the hole. And he moved about 18 inches, being monitored by the civilian who was down there. However, because they were pulling so hard on this rope to get Neil to move, the pressure from that rope was basically crushing Neil's chest, and he stopped breathing. And the civilian who was down there with Neil noticed it and yelled up to the group to stop. And they had to take the rope off because, they might be able to pull him out this way, but they would kill him. He would suffocate. And so once the civilian rescuer came out of the hole, he told the group, look, Neil's body is simply too big to be yanked out of the hole safely. He needs to be conscious and able to contort and twist his body, basically undoing what Neil did to get down there, in order to get out again. We need his participation, and he's unconscious, so we can't do that. And so at this point, the rescuers were totally desperate. They know Neil is still alive. They can hear some of his ragged breathing coming out of the hole, but they knew they had to do something drastic right now or Neil was gonna die. And so they came up with this plan for this even smaller rescuer, this woman, to go down into the hole, get to Neil, and break his collarbone to try to shrink his body to be able to pull him out. And so this woman, she goes down there and she reaches Neil, but she failed to break his collarbone. And so she too had to come out of the hole, leaving Neil behind. And so once the woman came out of the hole, it became clear to the rescuers that Neil was not getting out of this hole. even though he was just 40 feet away and at this moment still very much alive. They could hear his ragged breathing, but there was just nothing anybody could do. And so one of the rescuers called Neil's father and told him, "You need to come out to Peak Cavern." Not long after that, Neil's father, Eric Moss, arrived at Peak Cavern. Now, he knew going into this that his son was stuck. That's why he got the phone call to come out here. But he did not understand just how dire the situation really was. But as soon as he got to Peak Cavern and saw all these vehicles outside and the hundreds of rescuers coming in and out of the cave with these sad, dark expressions on their faces, Eric knew this was really bad. And so Eric made his way into Peak Cavern, and for hours he just hoped and prayed that whatever was happening would be enough to get his son out. And for hours, Eric just stood there in Peak Cavern, hoping to see his son emerge from the hole, hoping to come up and say everything is okay, but he didn't. And things only got worse. It eventually began to rain, and unfortunately, Peak Cavern, and specifically the hole that Neil was stuck inside of, flood when it rains. And so as rainwater is pouring into this cavern and Neil is still alive but stuck in this hole, they had to make the heart-wrenching decision in front of Neil's father to abandon the operation and get out of the cave, knowing Neil was going to die. Rescuers were finally able to get back into Peak Cavern at about 3 a.m. on March 24th, which is approximately 36 hours after Neil got trapped. By this point, the rains had subsided, the flood had cleared, and so they went in there hoping for a miracle. And when they got to the hole and listened into it, they actually heard Neil still breathing. He was still alive, but it was very clear he was at the end of his life. And all they could do was just sit around this hole and listen as Neil took his last few final ragged breaths. And then eventually they listened as Neil took his final breath and the hole went silent. Now, at this point, it was too dangerous to send anybody back down into this hole, and so no one could get physically close enough to Neil to actually confirm that he really is dead. However, after the hole remained silent for quite a while, a doctor who was on site did walk over and declare Neil dead. And so at this point, the rescue operation became a recovery operation. However, as rescuers were getting ready to go back down into the hole to retrieve Neil's body, it was at this point that Neil's father, Eric Moss, who had been there this whole time and had been witness to the doctor declaring his son dead, it was at this point that he stepped in and said, "Stop, get everybody out of the cave. I don't want anybody else to lose their lives." And so ultimately, Eric made the decision to leave his son's body where it was. Eventually, once it was 100% certain that Neil really must be dead at this point, they would fill in the hole that Neil had climbed down inside of with loose rocks from the cave, entombing him inside of it forever. And in his memory, the tunnel that Neil died inside of was named after him. It's called Moss Chamber.
Late one night in November of 1999, a 66-year-old minister named Colin Grant opened up the iron gates of a cemetery called Greyfriars Kirkyard. This cemetery was one of the oldest and most famous cemeteries in Edinburgh, Scotland. Now, the cemetery was basically pitch black. However, there were a few old iron lanterns that lined the cobblestone path that cut through the cemetery. And so Colin pushed open these big gates and he stepped onto this path and he began walking. And on either side of him, for as far as he could see, were all these headstones, some of which dated back to the 1600s. And as he kept walking, he could see up ahead, even in the darkness, the huge Gothic-style church that sat right in the center of the cemetery. Now, at first glance, this cemetery just kind of looked like a pretty typical old cemetery, albeit a pretty spooky one. But to Colin, he knew there was far more than just a graveyard here. Deep underground in this cemetery, below where all the people have been buried at their headstones, was basically another cemetery. There was like this mass burial pit that the cemetery had been built on top of. And in this lower level cemetery, which in no way was marked, I mean, this is basically a hidden mass burial, were thousands of people who had been starved and tortured to death hundreds of years ago. And so Colin stopped for a second on the path and just kind of stared ahead at this church. And for a second, he thought about just turning and leaving because he did not want to be here. He was really only here because the city had begged him to come here. Colin, in addition to being a minister, claimed to be a psychic, which meant he could speak to the dead. And so the city, in desperation, had asked him to come to this cemetery tonight and perform an exorcism. And so as much as Colin did just want to turn around and leave, he knew he really had a duty here, not just to the city, but really to the people of the city. Because if he didn't do this exorcism, there was a good chance more people were going to get hurt. The only thing that was making Colin a little bit less afraid in this moment was he actually was not alone in the cemetery. There were two people with him. There was a journalist and a photographer from a local newspaper who were basically tagging along to document this exorcism. And so, after taking a minute to compose himself, Colin continued walking deeper into the cemetery with these two following behind him. And then before reaching the big church, Colin left the path and began cutting through the grass, passing by different headstones, on the way to perhaps the most infamous building in the entire cemetery, the Black Mausoleum. The Black Mausoleum was this tall stone crypt with a rounded top that had been built sometime in the late 1600s. And as Colin got closer to this pretty creepy looking building that sat basically on the side of the cemetery, Colin began to feel this really intense sense of dread come over him. And the closer he got, that dread began to kind of manifest itself in like a pit in his stomach. And eventually he began feeling really scared of this building. And eventually Colin actually had to fully stop about 10 or so feet away from the building because he just felt like he couldn't go any closer. It felt evil. And then Colin turned and looked at his companions, the journalist and photographer, to see if maybe they were reacting to this mausoleum, but the two of them were just standing there with blank expressions on their face, like obviously not thinking that anything sinister was happening here. You know, even though the city had asked the minister to be here to perform this exorcism in this mausoleum, you know, it didn't mean everybody believed what was going on here, and clearly these two didn't. They were totally skeptical. But this didn't offend Colin. He was used to people not believing in the things he believed in. And he knew as soon as he actually began his work, you know, doing this exorcism, they would change their mind. And so at some point, Colin told the photographer that, hey, you know, I'm gonna go in the mausoleum now because I have to do the exorcism. Before I do, take a picture of the mausoleum. And so the photographer just raised her camera and took a picture of the mausoleum. Colin thanked her, and then he turned and began walking towards the building. And when he got right in front of it, he looked up and he read the name across the top of the crypt. And it said George Mackenzie. And as Colin read that, he could feel his heart rate start to spike. So back in the late 1600s, George Mackenzie was a Scottish lord who worked for the King of England, enforcing the king's religious laws. But at the time, these laws were very unpopular. And there was one group called the Covenanters who hated these laws so much that they actually mounted a full-scale rebellion in 1679. But their rebellion failed miserably, and this is when George Mackenzie came in. He captured over 1,000 Covenanters, and he marched them all into this huge field, which would later become the Greyfriars Kirkyard Cemetery, but at the time it was just a big open field. And he held them there, and for weeks he had these people starved and tortured and mutilated, and if anybody tried to run or resist because they knew they were doomed, I mean, they all knew they were going to die here, if anybody took off, he would capture them, cut their head off, and then place their head on a spike around the perimeter of this field, until after several weeks the entire field is just ringed with decaying bodies and bloody heads on spikes. And so after a few months of this, basically everybody in that field had been murdered in some horrible way by George Mackenzie. And their bodies were all dumped into a mass grave in Greyfriars Kirkyard and covered over, and then, you know, hundreds of years later, a proper cemetery would be built right on top of that mass grave. And then when George Mackenzie died later on, I mean, he lived a normal, happy, full life after doing all these horrible things, they built him this beautiful mausoleum in Greyfriars Kirkyard. And so here's this horrible person, George Mackenzie, who's a mass murderer, and he's put to rest in this beautiful mausoleum, just, you know, feet away from this mass grave of all these people he killed. For almost 300 years after Mackenzie was buried, Greyfriars Kirkyard was quiet. It was not considered a haunted place. That all changed, though, in 1998, so that was 1 year before Colin showed up to perform this exorcism. That year, in 1998, a homeless man broke into the Black Mausoleum and he fell through the floor and landed in one of those mass burial pits of those people Mackenzie had killed. And apparently, basically right after this happened, visitors to this cemetery began reporting the same thing. That anytime they were in or near the Black Mausoleum, they'd get pushed or tugged on or scratched or burned or even strangled. I mean, people were coming out of the cemetery terrified. And so quickly, people in town began to speculate about, you know, what was going on in the cemetery. And quickly, a story began to circulate around town that maybe when that guy fell through the floor in the mausoleum, that had released George Mackenzie's evil spirit, and his his spirit was responsible for all these attacks. And so it went on like this for about a year until finally this young woman was found outside of the Black Mausoleum, unconscious, looking like she'd been strangled, and when she came to, she had no memory of what happened, and so people assumed this had to be another attack by the spirit of George Mackenzie. And so by this point, the city was totally fed up with this. They didn't know what to do. And so they said, you know what? Let's just try an exorcism. Let's have someone go into that mausoleum and literally confront the spirit of George Mackenzie and banish him. Get him out of here and stop this madness. And so ultimately Colin was hired to perform this exorcism. As Colin stood there, reading the name George Mackenzie and mentally preparing himself to go inside of this horrible place, he realized he just couldn't do it. This was too much. And so Colin is just standing there feeling totally stressed out. He's embarrassed. He feels like a coward. He has no idea what he's going to say to the photographer and journalist who've literally come out here to document what he's going to do, and now he's not going to do it. But as Colin turned around to basically blurt out this really embarrassing news that, hey guys, we got to leave, he realized he actually knew something else he could do that in many ways might actually be better than going into this mausoleum and doing an exorcism. And so without saying anything, Colin just turned and began speed walking over to this big field that was not too far away from the Black Mausoleum. And when he got there, he just began chanting prayers and walking in circles, flicking holy water, didn't explain anything he was doing to the journalist and the photographer who'd followed him over there and are just watching him like, what's going on here? They got no idea. He's not clarifying. And for hours, this is what he did. He just kind of paced in this field, just kind of doing what looked like stereotypical, exorcism type behavior. And that's what the journalist and the photographer assumed he was doing. And so as Colin did whatever he was doing in this field, the photographer, whose name was Susan Burrell, just began doing her job, again, thinking that he was doing the exorcism. And so she just started taking pictures of him. And then finally, around 2 a.m., so again, this has been hours of Colin doing this thing he's doing, Colin just abruptly stops and walks over to Susan and the journalist, and Colin looks horrible. He's totally haggard, his hair's all disheveled, he's sweating, he's pale, and his head is down, and he says to the two women, "I failed." He explained to them that his original intention was to go into the Black Mausoleum and confront George Mackenzie's spirit head on and banish him from the cemetery. However, he had had a change of heart at the door and decided to go this other route, which was to go to this big open field in the middle of the cemetery and attempt to free the spirits of all those Covenanters who had been tortured and killed by George Mackenzie. Colin's thinking was, if I can free all of these poor tortured souls, that maybe once they're gone, George Mackenzie's spirit will also go away. And while, according to Colin, he was able to free, 200 some odd trapped souls, he said there were many more that still needed to be freed, and he just didn't have the strength. Like, he couldn't do this right now. And so he said, I have to rest and do this at another time. Now, the journalist and the photographer were totally over this and did not care at all. It's 2 a.m., they don't really understand what he was doing, they don't really know if this was the exorcism or if it was something else, but to them, they're like, okay, fine, we'll get out of here, it's late, it's not a big deal. And so the three of them, they began walking out of the cemetery, and right when they got in front of the church, so basically between where the Black Mausoleum was and where that field was, where Colin had been for the past several hours, Colin abruptly stopped, and he told the journalist and the photographer that actually, you know what? He had a little strength left, and he felt like it was his duty to try this again, because he knew he could free more souls, and so he was going to give it another go. And so the journalist and the photographer are like, okay. And so Colin, he gets out his Bible and he begins kind of doing the same thing he was doing out in the field, walking around, chanting Bible verses, spraying holy water all around. And then at some point, for reasons he did not explain to either Susan or the journalist, he pulled out 12 candles from his backpack that he had brought along, and he put them in a circle on the ground right in front of this church. It also encompassed this big Celtic cross that was on the ground. And Colin was inside of this circle, and he lit all these candles, and the whole time again, he's chanting out these Bible verses, and he stands up, and right after all the candles have been lit, suddenly Susan and the journalist noticed that the candles begin to flicker. And it's not windy at all inside the cemetery, like they shouldn't be flickering. And at the same time, Colin seemed to sense that something was happening around him, and he turned his whole body, his whole presence, and he looked over at the Black Mausoleum and began chanting these Bible verses louder and louder, like he was aiming them at the Black Mausoleum. And as he was doing this, the candles were flickering more and more and more. And at some point, Colin actually picked up one of these candles and kind of held it out at the Black Mausoleum. And so at this point, the journalist and the photographer, Susan, they're sensing that something weird is happening here. Like, this is spooky what they're seeing. Like, why are the candles flickering? What's going on with Colin? Like, what's happening here? And for a minute, the two of them kind of abandoned their actual job, which is to document what they're seeing. And they just stood there kind of witnessing this totally bizarre event. But then Susan sort of broke out of it. She lifted up her camera, and right as Colin is passionately chanting out these verses, she takes a picture of him, and the second she does, the flash lights up the cemetery, and then after the flash goes away, Colin, it was like the light went out on him, and he just crumpled to the ground. And so the journalist immediately ran over to Colin to see if he was okay, and Colin, who's like barely conscious at this point, he just kept repeating, "This is going to kill me, this is going to kill me." And so Susan was about to run over and join her colleague and make sure Colin was okay, but before she did, she glanced down at her camera to see the picture she had taken of Colin right before he collapsed. And as she glanced at it, she couldn't believe what she was looking at. At first she thought, maybe this is some trick of the light, like this can't be right. But then she zoomed in on the photo, and when she looked closely, she screamed. Here's the photograph that Susan took. As you can see, Colin the minister is standing there with the candle outstretched, and behind him is the big church, and on the church, on the left side, there are windows. Now, this church was locked up. Nobody was inside the church at the time. But you can clearly see in the left window, there is a figure in that window looking out at Colin. Now, of course, this is not evidence enough to make everybody believe that, oh, that must be George Mackenzie's spirit staring out at Colin. He's the reason Colin collapsed. But I'll tell you, this photograph is not the end of the story. Remember, after Colin collapsed to the ground, after this photo was taken, the journalist ran over, and all Colin kept saying was, "This is gonna kill me, this is gonna kill me." Well, it would turn out he'd be right. Not long after this failed exorcism, Colin would die inexplicably. His death would come as a total shock to his friends and family. No one has ever been able to debunk the photo that Susan took that showed that dark figure in the window of the church, meaning nobody knows what that was. The church really was supposed to be empty and locked, and so how is there somebody or something in the window? Nobody knows. A lot of people think that could be the evil spirit of George Mackenzie, striking Colin down, and Susan managed to capture it on film. But, it's up to you if you believe that or not. But I will say, to this day, people go into that cemetery and come out with scratch marks on them and, claiming they were pushed or pulled or strangled. And so that cemetery is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the world. And George Mackenzie's spirit, who supposedly haunts it, is considered to be one of the most dangerous poltergeists in the world as well.
All your tired days, the quiet ways you made life stay. Morning coffee, same old chair. You were always just there. I used to think you'd never change, like time would skip your face. The photos started telling me what I refused to see. Now I notice every line, every pause in your voice sometimes, and it hits me. Quiet eyes, yeah. Surrounded by faces, still feeling unseen. Laughing on the outside, drowning in between. Phone full of numbers, no one to call. I learned being noticed ain't the same as being known at all. They ask how you doing, I say I'm fine. That word learned how to lie over time. I master smiling, hiding the cracks, carrying weight that never shows on my back. I scroll through moments I wasn't invited to feel, watching life happen through someone else's reel. I'm present, I'm breathing, I'm here somehow, but my mind feels.
Before I became a professional, strange, dark, and mysterious storyteller, I served in the military. And during my time in the military, I had some pretty wild experiences. But what I remember most about my time in service was not my own stories, but rather the stories I heard from other service members. Keep in mind, service members are sent to some of the most